Constitution.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about real versus imaginary problems. Now, I guess this isn't too ironic considering the Idaho legislature is in the process of wrapping up its latest session, and it's been a tumultuous session, but it's curious what constitutes a problem to some people versus what is imaginary. And trust me, there are plenty of things out there that people want to consider problems that they want to have solved by taxpayer money or government power, forcing people to bend the knee one way or the other. And yes, it can be found on both sides of the political aisle. Okay, this is not just strictly a left-wing thing. It seems like you can almost separate people into two different categories. And I know in the era of gender politics and identity politics, it's all about, well, what group do you belong to? But the only two distinctions that really matter are you a decent person or are you an indecent person? And more often than not, that is going to be determined by your behavior. Your behavior is either decent or it's indecent. Now, I'm going to break it down just a little bit further in that the people who typically are willing to engage or embrace or engage in indecent behavior are people who are seeking dominion over others. In other words, they want to control what other people do, say, think, believe, what they can do with their money, etc. The decent people don't. It's really that simple. If you lust to control other people, you've got a little tyrant in there that needs to be reined in. Speaking of reining in that little tyrant, maybe this won't be surprising. Oh, there's a familiar face. Why, it's Jim Jones, former Attorney General, and he really shed some interesting light on real versus imaginary problems in his latest op-ed, which was recently published in the Twin Falls Times News or MagicValley.com. Legislative extremists, one of his favorite words, have found a groovy new toy, and they won't let go of it. What on earth could he be talking about? Well, Jim explains himself a bit by talking about abortion. First of all, he talks about the Roe decision that was overturned last year. Now, he says the Roe decision, the original decision back in 1973, had placed restrictions on what a state could do to limit abortions. I'm going to say that in a slightly different way. What it did was it implemented a one-size-fits-all solution for all the states under the auspices of the federal government saying, nope, abortion on demand is legal. And basically that was that. It forced a solution on states that did not want abortion on demand, particularly elective abortions. And those states that already allowed it, well, they were just like, now everybody is just like us. Legislators, Jim says, cast their eyes upon the state of Texas, which had just passed a statute designed to bypass those restrictions. Now, again, the federal government restricting the states, we have to understand something here that I think Jim may have forgotten since he was in law school, or maybe he never even studied this, but the states created the federal government. Do you understand the difference between a creature and the creator? The creature can never exceed the creator. And it was the states who came together in a compact, a multi-party contract called the U.S. Constitution, which called the federal government into existence. So when the federal government deigns to put on these restrictions on the states, it's acting out of its scope. And that's exactly what the overturning of Roe v. Wade was about last year. Now, Texas, to their credit, found a way to get out of that federal one-size-fits-all approach by allowing private citizens to sue anyone who knowingly aided or abetted an abortion after a fetal heartbeat could be detected. Someone bringing a successful suit was entitled to what Jim calls a bounty of at least $10,000. See, he's making it sound like this is the latest multi-level get-rich-quick scheme. He says our legislators were captivated with the Texas bounty law and followed suit in the 2022 session with a statute that gives the abortion patient and her family members the right to recover a minimum amount of $20,000 apiece from an abortion provider. After the Roe decision was overturned later in the year, another Idaho abortion law went into effect. Now, he's taking the angle that the only reason people could possibly want to do this is because this is a way to make easy money. Notice there's no mention of the innocent life that's at stake, which has been the crux of the conflict over Roe v. Wade since 1973 and even before. I like how Jim pretends this is really all about money. That's a politician right there. Right and wrong? No, that doesn't matter. Money and power, that's what matters. And he's sure this is what people are doing. Having seen the utility of giving private citizens the ability to accomplish what the government might not be legally able to do, the legislature sought to use the private lawsuit strategy in any number of situations. The drag show bill, look at the scare quotes there, the drag show bill. No, they're real, Jim. They're not just a figment of your imagination. House Bill 265 provides a $10,000 bounty. It's a penalty. It's for someone violating legislation here. Each time a minor is exposed to some loosely defined, here's the scare quotes again, sexual conduct. How could we even know what that is? You wouldn't know if it was shaking it right there in your face. No, Jim, most of us would actually know, and especially would know if it's being done in front of minor children. So clutch those pearls a little tighter. This bill passed the House by a wide margin. There may not be time to act upon it in the Senate. These bounty bills and a number of others have attorney fee provisions that benefit only the person suing. The party defending can't recover fees if it wins the case. This is a strong incentive for filing frivolous suits. Again, that's a lawyer speaking. Well, of course, if you gave me that window, I'd be filing all kinds of suits, if I wasn't too busy chasing ambulances, presumably. Senate Bill 1100, which the governor signed into law on March 23rd, allows a person to recover a bounty or to see a penalty enforced of $5,000 from the school each time the student encounters a person of the opposite sex in a restroom or certain other school facilities. Now, this is not, like the janitor is cleaning and, the student inadvertently walked in, didn't realize, oh, this restroom's closed for cleaning. We're talking about schools that have implemented policies that willingly and knowingly put opposite sex students or students who were born male into the girls' restroom or into the girls' locker room. Okay, this is not about some accidental thing that people are going to be exploiting. It's about forcing gender confusion upon our children. And yes, a $5,000 penalty is possible if schools or districts violate this. House Bill 314 provides a $2,500 bounty. There's your scare quotes, Jim, against the library each time a kid gets his hands on material, scare quotes, harmful to minors in the library stacks. The House passed the bill. Actually, the Senate did too. At the time Jim published this, he didn't realize it. The Senate has passed it. Now it goes to the governor. But see, he's saying that these are imaginary problems. I can envision dozens of overzealous parents filing harassment suits in their local libraries, causing the libraries to rack up thousands of dollars in defense costs without a means of recovering those fees when they prevail in the suits. Almost all other civil suit statutes call for the winning party to recover its attorney fees from the loser. That prevents most abusive lawsuits. You see the presumption here that parents are going to be abusive of the law and they're just going to milk this system? I don't know why, but that seems fitting coming from a politician, someone who is willing to milk the system and willing to twist the system to his or her liking. You'll see why I say this in just a moment. Jim says the fixation of legislative extremists with solving problems that do not really exist really is troubling enough. Writing and passing poorly drafted legislation that is designed to intimidate rather than to accomplish worthwhile goals is an abuse of our governmental system, says the guy who cannot imagine the state ever being wrong. Problems that really do not exist. Well, what, pray tell, would have people thinking that these problems exist? Jim doesn't really want to answer that. The only way he'll answer questions like this is, well, we did a study once and it said that we couldn't find anybody who was teaching critical race theory. But you will find critical race theory nonetheless in many schools, just being taught under a slightly different name. See? Well, that's not strictly speaking critical race theory, but it is. Just it's under a different name. Okay, it's branding. It's packaging. The product you're getting is still trash. It's pollution for these students' minds. It's teaching them to either hate other people or hate themselves based on skin color. It's a divisive philosophy. It has no business being in the schools. Likewise, we've seen parents go and actually check out for themselves and for their kids materials that are undeniably obscene, undeniably graphic, teaching all different types of perversions and variations of sexual either self-abuse or abuse of others. But, oh no, that's a problem that just doesn't really exist. So says Jim. This proliferation of culture war lawsuit legislation, he says, reminds me of those days when the baby discovers a groovy new toy and simply won't let go of it. Some legislators are so fascinated by their new civil suit strategy that they can't get enough of it, regardless of the fact that their strategy is likely to clog the court system with cases that simply have no merit. They would do us all a favor by working to address Idaho's real problems. Jim, what do you think those real problems are? We'll talk about budget here in just a moment, but, we're talking about people trying to access kids, trying to indoctrinate kids into left-wing ideology. And Jim this is no problem. As if this is the normal thing. People should just embrace this. They should just accept that it's okay. Thankfully, people are not accepting that it's okay. And frankly, it's pushed far enough and fast enough that we've reached a certain rebound point and people are now pushing back. And sadly, because look, as lovers of freedom, you don't want to get the state involved. You want to solve problems at the lowest possible level. In this case, it's worthwhile to draw official, as in enforceable, boundaries around our kids and around those areas of life where we don't need this kind of left-wing meddling getting a free play. But hey, tell us more about those non-existent problems, that only Jim can't seem to see, but other people are seeing and recognizing. And this is one of the funny things too. They say, well, this has never really actually happened. I know in the case of the bill, is it House Bill 71, preventing or prohibiting rather mutilation and hormone therapy for minors who are undergoing transgender issues or having gender dysphoria. Somebody proudly said, well, we don't even have those surgeries here in Idaho. But look, you don't have to be psychic or clairvoyant in order to see what's coming. Just look at the number of gender of affirmation clinics or gender care medical clinics that existed, even 10 years ago versus today. It's big money because there are lots and lots of follow-up visits. It takes a long time to get a person, set up, in their newly assigned gender. And that's a tremendous amount of money to be made by those people who are the medical providers. But where you're dealing with minors, we don't have to wait until suddenly 1 in 10 kids is starting to get gender reassignment surgery, or what we euphemistically are being told to call gender affirming care. It's a big enough problem. It needs to be nipped in the bud now. Now, when they're 18, when they're old enough to make those decisions for themselves, they can knock themselves out. They can do whatever they want to do. Nobody's gonna stop them. But when they're too young to make those decisions for themselves, why would we allow young people to hurt themselves or to mutilate themselves permanently for the sake of scratching an itch that may not even be there as they grow and mature and sort out, whatever it is that they're dealing with? All right, moving on to other things here. The Porn and Library Bill passes 26-9. Senator Scott Herndon points out, Republicans Hartgen and Schroeder voted against it. It will only bar schools and libraries from making material harmful to minors available to minors. You see the distinction here? It doesn't ban books. It holds people accountable if they make material harmful to minors available to those minors. Strict definitions were used in this. I don't see a lot of reporting on this in the mainstream press, but hey, I've kind of come to expect that they're going to take the path of least resistance. Speaking of the path of least resistance, here's what chutzpah looks like. Governor Brad Little is taking credit for a property tax relief bill. And this is, by the way, the very same bill that was sent to him a few days ago, which he then vetoed. Why? Well, we'll explain more about why he vetoed it, but basically the legislature got together and they overrode the governor's veto. Rather than admit that, he had actually been spanked by the legislature, Brad found himself a parade and started marching in front of it. I asked the legislature to deliver a simple property tax relief solution, not one intermingled with a hodgepodge of policy items attached to it. The legislature addressed my concerns, and we got property tax relief done right. Yes, take credit for something which you absolutely opposed and vetoed. But, Governor, they went ahead and they overturned your veto. So, you can dance in front of the parade if you want to, but you're not fooling anybody. By the way, that's an interesting flag you're waving. Maybe we should talk about that later. Brian Allman points out, one point that should be made about the override today, every Democrat in the legislature voted to sustain Governor Little's veto, basically agreeing with him, while all but one Republican voted to override it. And he says, remind me, with which party Governor Little is affiliated. It's true. He gets some really good acceptance and some really good press from the Democrats, which I guess is why he's trying to claim, claim credit for, well, look, we finally got this property tax relief going on here. By the way, the Idaho Freedom Foundation pointed out today the governor overrode Governor Little's veto of the property tax bill, H-292. Despite him claiming credit, this happened despite Governor Little, not because of him. As a co-equal branch of government, the legislature exercised the authority delegated to it by the people. And you know what? The more I look at generally at the Idaho legislature, the more grateful I am for those individuals who are representing us both in the Senate and in the House, because Governor Little, again, he seems to have aligned with all the right special interests, but he seems to come down on the side of the Democrats more often than not. And that's not to say that all Democrats are bad people. But given what they have been pushing and given what the governor has been pushing, there's really not a distinction between them. All right, next we'll talk about why Idaho's establishment politicians aren't interested in providing tax relief. This is from a story that was published by the Idaho Freedom Foundation back on March 27th. It would be wrong to argue that Idaho's establishment politicians aren't interested in providing tax relief, but it's clear from the governor's actions and the actions of the state Senate that concerns about high property taxes and out-of-control government spending are secondary to the demands of special interests that want to continue business as usual. Now, the legislative session opened with a $1.9 billion surplus. Now the lawmakers are struggling across the finish line with token tax relief and a message they'll protect the education bureaucracy from any real accountability at the ballot box. Once the legislative session is adjourned, the lawmakers behind the political brinkmanship will argue that they behaved as conservatives, but rest assured, we will continue to hold state elected officials accountable for their shenanigans by arming you with the truth about what really transpired here in Boise. This is one of the reasons why the Idaho Freedom Foundation catches an awful lot of hate, because they will tell you what these politicians are up to, even when the politicians don't really want you to know, because it blows their cover. Well, of course, I run as a conservative, and as long as it's campaign season, I will be the most rock-ribbed conservative you've ever seen. But yeah, when they govern just like any big government statist, be it Democrat or be it Republican, and they do come in all flavors. So it's good to see that there is accountability. Also, the Idaho Freedom Foundation has been exposing obscene materials in Idaho libraries for years. In 2021, we warned the public and lawmakers about a woke nonprofit coordinating with the Idaho Commission for Libraries to disseminate books to toddlers about gender identity and sexual orientation. Why do kids that young need to know this? I don't know. There was a time we actually prized innocence for young people, especially little children. In 2022, we demonstrated how cash grants from Washington were being used to circumvent local control of libraries. We exposed how libraries were stocking their shelves with graphic children's books, promoting, among other things, kinky sex, sexual deviancy, and early sex among children. In 2023, we brought attention to how Idaho public school libraries have become facilitators for a far-left agenda that warps both sex and gender through exposure to pornographic material as well as noxious propaganda. That would be the CRT stuff. We showed how a system of reviewers, stakeholders, federal agencies, and public employees facilitates the provision of inappropriate books for minors in our public schools and libraries. This is the work of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and it's one of the reasons they catch so much hate. Because this is stuff that you're not supposed to notice. You're supposed to be so busy, living life and having fun and doing whatever it is that you're doing that you just outsource all that governance and let us take care of the details. But when we do that, look at the sneaky stuff that has to take place. And look at them scurry like cockroaches when the light of day is shined on them. But we aren't done yet, says the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Interest groups and librarians across the state and country have been fighting tooth and nail to protect the education establishment and allow public schools and libraries to continue promoting and distributing this obscene pornographic material to children. Governor Little still needs to sign House Bill 314 to protect children from harmful materials and stop this unmitigated disaster in our beloved state. Amen. I mean, this is just how it has to be, I guess. Somebody's got to stand up and put their foot down and say enough. And I'm grateful for the analysts, and I'm grateful for the people who are willing to suffer, the smears and the name calling and the second guessing of motives being dished out by legacy media here in Idaho every time that their politicians are held to account, every time the Idaho Freedom Foundation stands up for the principles of limited government, personal freedom, lower taxes, more responsibility being used on the personal level to solve as many problems as possible. Statists hate that kind of thing. By the way, here's one more headline to just kind of give you a flavor of how does the legacy media view things. Well, there's a bill to criminalize help for Idaho minors' abortions. Wait a minute. Wait, what are we talking about? Well, it's a bill that seeks to criminalize helping minors get an abortion without parental consent. And it's one final passage in Idaho's legislature. It's headed for the governor's desk. Let me just ask you this. I mean, just take it outside of politics for a moment. How is a person who is helping a minor get an abortion without her parents' consent, how are they the good person? How are they a good person here? I mean, I'm sorry, you can try and convince me that, the medical establishment wouldn't listen or the parents wouldn't listen to reason, but it all comes down to there's this twisted mentality that says if we're not killing children, if we're not killing babies, somehow we are missing out on everything that makes life worthwhile. I mean, I've seen legislators shedding tears. I'm just so concerned for these women who won't be able to have abortions. And why are we treating this like this is the high sacrament of life? It definitely is a sacrament of sorts for people on the political left, and they fight very hard to preserve that right to kill and to take innocent life however they see fit. How strange that legacy media just has thrown in 100% with that left-wing point of view. Yes, we want to criminalize help for Idaho minors' abortions. And why not? It's just sick and wrong to suggest that, yes, this is helping people in the best possible way. Humanity at its finest. Now, may we kill your baby, please? By the way, the Senate has passed H369. This is another thing to pay attention to. Appropriating $4.5 billion for Medicaid. Now, while this bill was an improvement over the $4.7 billion budget from earlier this month, it still represents an astonishing amount of government waste. And I would encourage you, if you are a person who is intellectually honest, okay, if you're not just looking for political talking points that you can then go out and parrot as your own, take the time to read the analysis of H369. Nicholas Kleinworth does a marvelous job for the Idaho Freedom Foundation in analyzing why the budget misses the mark in terms of being responsible, in terms of being transparent. And there's still tens of thousands, I think it was close to 150,000 people whose eligibility are still, it's questionable as whether or not they would belong on the Medicaid rolls. The taxpayers deserve responsibility, or they deserve accountability and transparency when it comes to how their money is spent. After all, they're the ones who earned this. They're the ones who put in the blood, sweat, and tears that represents that money that is then taxed away from them and is then redistributed. And there's also the aspect to think of, too. When it comes from Medicaid, it's coming from the federal government. No money comes from the federal government without significant strings attached. So if you want to see us lose more and more local control over our medical decisions in Idaho, this is a great way to do it. Just lap up all that money that is being sent your way by the federal government and trust Uncle Sugar to do what is necessary to keep you happy and safe. Or, this is an alternative, we could also look at standing on our own feet, solving more of our own problems, and lowering the cost of government, and shrinking the size of government, and shrinking the influence of government in our lives. But, offer that to someone who is a dedicated statist, be they, establishment Republican or hardcore left-wing Democrat, and they're going to react roughly the same way that a vampire would react if you offer them a bushel of garlic or a crucifix. They're going to recoil and hiss. All right, one final note here. I just, I marvel sometimes at the lengths to which people will go to cast doubt and to cast shadows upon, to throw some shade at the Idaho Freedom Foundation. No one has been more obsessive about this than Mary Souza, former senator. And boy, her tattletale tell-all columns in the Coeur d'Alene Press are really something to behold. But I do love that we can have a little bit of a giggle at her expense. Love the new fragrance, Mary Souza. Obsession. It's a real one, and apparently she's making very good use of it. Thanks again for joining us. This is Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. And look, my job here is not to tell you what to think. My job is just to encourage you. Think more deeply about what you're being told by legacy media. Think about whether they are actually standing up for your freedom or simply telling you to go back to sleep while you're being fitted for a straitjacket of sorts by people who pretend to be helping you. Thanks again for watching.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.